thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we're talking about what I think actually is a really important play. I have not been that affected in the theatre for quite a long time, I have to say. Can you outline for us what the play is about?
I certainly can. So this is a play that was commissioned by Nottingham Playhouse, the wonderful Adam Penford, who asked James Graham, the busiest man in show business, to write a play. So you can imagine how long that took to actually happen. And it's about a real-life incident that took place in Nottingham in 2011, where a young man called Jacob Dunn, who grew up on the Meadows estate there, quite a notorious estate in Nottingham, on a night out, punched another young man, James Hodgkinson, and who subsequently died from his injuries. And that is a very common thing, which is something that a lot of people don't know, that there is a campaign called One Punch, because more people than you think die from that. And it's easily done. Lads out fighting, and 2 lives changed forever because of it. And that certainly was the case in this incident. And the parents of James, the victim, over many, many months, after being extremely disappointed and frustrated and embittered by the criminal justice system and the court system, who gave Jacob a very short sentence relatively, they decided to engage in restorative justice. And that's really what the play is about. It's based on Jacob's autobiography, which is called Right from Wrong. So it's very much from his perspective in many ways. But they engaged him in restorative justice first by letters, where they asked him what had happened, because they didn't have any answers as to why it had happened in the first place. And Jacob really responded to that. And over time, they met. And the sort of dramatic climax of the play really is the meeting between Joan and David, James's parents, and Jacob, sort of facilitated by Remedy, the restorative justice organisation. And beyond that, Joan and Jacob went on to work together and talk together in prisons and schools and in different settings about toxic masculinity, alcohol-related violence, the One Punch, and restorative justice and forgiveness, ultimately. And the Forgiveness Project, which is an incredible organisation, have been very involved from the start as well, and Jacob's very involved with them, as is Joan. And that is an organisation that helps victims of crime and perpetrators to find a way through, because rather than being a very wafty liberal thing, forgiveness, which is what a lot of people think it is, it actually has teeth. It's something very rigorous and takes an enormous amount of courage, and is often the only option left, because you are just left with so much bitterness and anger over the loss of a child in this case, or whatever, that there has to be a way through. And they have done quite a lot of wraparound care in Nottingham, and we did an incredible after-show discussion with them the other night, facilitated by the Forgiveness Project, where everybody in the audience stayed, which is such an unusual thing for a Q&A, especially after quite a long show. But I feel like everybody needed to hear from them and to process what they'd seen, because it's a play that very necessarily puts you in the shoes of all the characters and makes you wonder how you would respond and if you would be capable of taking part in a process like restorative justice. So it's been a really amazing journey, and after being in Nottingham, where it had an incredible response, it then moved to the Young Vic, and it's been wonderful doing it down here.
Well, I was going to ask you that actually. You've been sitting with June as a character. Have you met her?
Yes, yeah. So Jacob's been very involved from the beginning, and James had worked with Jacob on the scripts. We only had half a play when we all committed to it, because he hadn't written the second half, and Joan and David were very absent from that, because it was very much from Jacob's perspective at that point. So Joan and David entered the process quite a bit later, and there is a world actually where we as an audience wouldn't meet Joan and David until Jacob did. But I think that everybody felt that an audience would want to hear from them sooner and see the process that took them to ultimately being able to sit in a room with him and then more astoundingly, to work with him and to help him turn his life around. He got his GCSEs and then ended up getting a degree, and it purely down to their encouragements, because he wanted to do something to make his life better for them. So Joan and David, we had a Zoom with them, and then I went on BBC Breakfast with Joan, so we'd had a little meeting, and then they turned up into rehearsals in Nottingham where we did a run through for them. And I can honestly say that was one of the hardest things that any of us have had to do, because sitting in a well-lit rehearsal room, acting out, the worst moments of their life, turning off James's life support machine, and it felt really, really wrong.
Right.
And I really questioned what we were doing at that point.
Did it feel quite intrusive?
It felt incredibly intrusive, exploitative, just gruesome, almost, actually. They were sitting a few feet away from us, and I was like, what am I doing? What am I doing play acting this terrible moment? But because they are the people that they were incredibly gracious and they were incredibly generous. They had some things to say, David more than Joan, actually, about certain lines and the way that the characters were drawn. David was quite anxious that he wasn't too angry, because although he did feel that anger, he didn't really express it in that way. He's a very peaceful man. And they've just been incredible. Joan came to Nottingham lots and lots of times with different family members, and they both came to the first preview in London, and she'll be back. David won't come again, but Joan will come a few times, and it's very painful for her. And there's been some extra scenes added in this version of it that pave the way a little bit more and show a little bit more of their bitterness and anger and frustration that weren't in the Nottingham production, and they're happy for that, and they understand that art and theatre is an amazing tool for social change and for spreading a story. And to have someone like James Graham telling that story, you're in safe hands. Not just because he's the State of the Nation playwright and talks about everything that leads to that moment, including the architecture of social housing and the criminal justice system, but because of his absolute humanity, I think, as a person and as a writer. I wouldn't say that to his face, but